Can everybody hear me at the back? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Arjun, for a very kind introduction, and thank you for coming, especially thank you for the very young people. I want to start with an apology to the young people over here, the very young people, young at heart. I will have some equations. The reason I have equations is because I am trained as a scientist, and mathematics is the language of science. And if a picture is supposed to be worth 1,000 words, I believe an equation is worth 1,000 pictures. So equations try to compress what we try to do when we try to learn about the world. So I hope that the young people will forgive me. So I have a solution if you don't understand the equations, or if you're getting bored, hum. Okay, a very famous English chemist said that when he used to read papers where there were equations, he would just hum along. So you can also do the same thing. All right, so I want to tell you about where we are in a story which started about 10 years ago. And the story is actually about 15 years ago, but 10 years ago we really started putting some effort into this, which is associated with trying to understand how collections of organisms, like the collections of people gathered over here, they don't have to be organisms as we are over here as people. They can be insects, they can be swarms of robots and so on. What can they do which is better? And unfortunately, sometimes what can they do which is much worse? And so I want to tell you a series of vignettes associated with this. But in order to start that, I want to show you a movie which perhaps almost everybody has seen. I'm sure the young people over here have seen on some BBC documentary or the other. So this is essentially a video taken over Rome, as you might recognize from the BBC. And what you see are birds. You see starlings, and they're quite beautiful to behold. You can just keep staring at them, and I have, and you can. And they're quite spectacular just because of the patterns that they are capable of showing. Of course, birds are not the only kinds of organisms which show these remarkable patterns, and I'll come to what they do it for, why they do it, how do we understand them. But you can also see the same thing on many, many different levels. You can see this if you look under a microscope, where we were just shown as part of a conference that I am attending, we were shown some remarkable microscopes where, for example, you can see what happens in the inside of a cell. You see tiny little flows inside a cell, or for example, in my gut or in your gut, or perhaps in my upper respiratory tract, you have sometimes bacteria, maybe during an infection, and these bacteria also can do remarkable things together, which they can't do individually. For example, they can make me sick, but of course my body fights back, and eventually I may become well. Or over here on a much larger scale, so this is on a very, very small scale, a fraction of the thickness of a human hair, so maybe a 50th or a 60th the size of a thickness of a human hair. This is maybe about a 10th the thickness of a human hair. This is now many times a human. You can see over here a diver who is amidst a school of fish. And then you cannot just think about these as they happen naturally in the world. You can also start thinking about artificially. You can have swarms of cars. You can have swarms of robots. And what are the kinds of questions that you can ask? So if you're a biologist, you just want to describe them. As a natural historian, that's the science of just understanding the world as it is by collecting information. You can just say, I want to just characterize these patterns as they appear in the world with the hope of eventually trying to classify, compress, comprehend, and maybe even control them. But if you think about it from a physical or a mathematical perspective, which is what I would like to try and introduce you to, you can ask questions about how is this kind of behavior, the behaviors which to our eyes are beautiful to behold, how are they constrained by, for example, the laws of physics? And what are the laws of physics? Certain things can't happen. Nothing can happen faster than the speed of light, for example. Well, that's a law of physics. That's not particularly relevant over here. Or if I try to essentially move and hold your hand, I can only do so over an extent which is comparable to the extent of my body. I can't essentially go out and reach much further. However, if I blow air, then eventually you will be able to sense that. And similarly, what happens where you are will affect me, but it'll take a certain amount of time. So there are very simple to state, but not so easy to understand the consequences of laws associated with physics. And question is, how are these collective behaviors constrained by physics? So here is a list of the kinds of the what, the how, and the why questions that one can ask from this perspective. So you can ask, for example, what are the different kinds of patterns that form? Are the kinds of patterns that form similar to the ones that are make you and me? Am I more like a solid? Well, most of the time, most of my body is a solid. Of course, some part of my body is a fluid. For example, the blood that courses through my arteries and veins, as in your case as well, it's a fluid. Of course, some parts of it temporarily could be gaseous, for example, the part that's essentially allowing me to speak to you. So you can have questions associated with which parts are solid-like, which parts are fluid-like, which parts are gas-like, or if all the birds in a flock are moving in one direction, are they all essentially associated with a particular orientation and particular velocity? Or are they essentially moving in different forms, different ways? So you can ask questions associated with what are the different types of order, and what are the transitions between these kinds of orders? When I'm living, I'm one kind of an organism. When I'm sick, perhaps one part of my body is behaving slightly differently. When I'm no more, nothing exists, or at least my body doesn't exist. Perhaps memories exist. So what kinds of phases and what kinds of transitions between them is a first kind of question that one can ask. The next question that you can ask is, if I first classify them, then I can ask, how do I understand them in the context of how they form? I already told you that, for example, this room is air-conditioned. It's air-conditioned because somebody is essentially, or an engine is moving fluid around. That engine is doing some work, but once that engine has done work, then the fluid moves around because of differences in density, because of differences in temperature, and so on and so forth. So fluids can move around. My body is moving around because I'm essentially volitionally forcing it to. But if I had a very sloppy jello on the table, for example, it will gradually start to deform. If I had two chemicals which react, then they can essentially create a third one. Or if I had a high concentration of an aroma in one corner of the room, that high concentration will gradually move around. So there are passive mechanisms which cause all the things that this world is made of, all the physical objects that this world, all the matter that this world is made of, which essentially allows them to essentially move, for example, according to laws which we can write down mathematically, which are completely passive. And yet, that's not enough, because I wanted to describe organisms. I want to try and understand how you behave, how an ant behaves, how a zebra in the savannah behaves. I have to also ask questions about how do they essentially consume energy and move? How do they sense each other? How do they sense the world? How do they cooperate with each other? Do they compete with each other? Do they decide when they compete with each other, sometimes to cooperate, sometimes to compete? Do they create these remarkable social constructs like governments, like buildings, like universities? So those are the kinds of questions you can ask. These are much, much more recent questions that people from mathematics and physics have come to, of course, in economics, in social sciences, and in the living sciences. People have been thinking about these for a very, very long time, but mostly from a descriptive point of view. Can we go beyond these descriptive perspectives and become quantitative? And the reason that you can ask these questions from a physical point of view is to say, when and how do these phases and phase transitions occur? But from a biological point of view, from a social science point of view, you can also ask, why do they matter? A very important question is, what are the functional consequences? It's not enough to just describe these beautiful things, although I think for a lot of us, including me, that is sufficient. But you can also ask questions about why do they matter? And I want to start this by telling you something about nouns, which essentially describe collectives. And the reason I put this up is because every one of these nouns essentially evokes a particular kind of function. Edward Lear, a poet, a Victorian poet from the 19th century, wrote wonderful poems about and illustrations about collections of organisms. And here is a list. It's a small fraction of a list which you can find, for example, on Wikipedia or on the internet. And I love each one of these things because each one of them evokes some particular function. So if I thought about owls, I've already written the answer over here. What might you think? Well, it's a parliament of owls, a shrewdness of apes, an obstinacy of buffaloes. Every one of them evokes something wonderful. A crash of rhinos, a stench of skunks, an exaltation of larks. And I'll ask you for one, what might a group of scholars be called? You can look it up. I have a suggestion, maybe a curiosity of scholars. We are in Abu Dhabi, so I want to ask you one more question. So Abu Dhabi, I gathered, means the father of the gazelle, I think. So you can ask, what is a collection of gazelles called? Well, in English, it's fairly straightforward and kind of boring. It's a herd of gazelles. But I learned, by looking up, and I hope I can pronounce it correctly, that a collection of gazelles in Arabic would be, I think, Kati min al-Tsiba, or Kati min al-Gazalan. And correct me if I'm wrong. Okay? So So now you can ask, oh, with each one of these very beautiful ways of describing collections, why do they occur? So we want to not only understand how these behaviors are constrained by the laws of physics, we also want to try and understand something about what do they do, okay? How does physics enable and constrain collective behavior? And I want to do this by essentially evoking a set of questions which goes back to an ethologist, a scientist who studies behavior, a very famous one, Nicholas Tinbergen. Nicholas Tinbergen, along with Carl von Frisch and Konrad Lorenz in 1967 and 1968, shared the Nobel Prize in Physiology of Medicine. I think probably the only perhaps a prize given in physiology of medicine for the study of behavior. And Tinbergen was a Dutch ethologist. It's also interesting, his brother, also in Tinbergen, I forget his first name, also got a Nobel Prize in economics, so quite a remarkable family. And so Tinbergen asked the following question in the context of individual behavior. He said, well, first you have to ask, what is that behavior? Okay, so if I'm moving towards or moving away from something, behavior is locomotion. If I'm sniffing, that's another kind of behavior. So first question that you can ask is, what is the function of that particular behavior that you see? So the what question. Second question that you can ask is, how is that behavior caused? So what is the organism responding to? How is it then taking that information from the outside world and then converting it to a causation, eventually leading to an action? So the what is followed by a how. And in biology, we always like to ask questions in two ways. One, how that happens in an individual, and secondly, how that happens over time. So you can ask a question about having a behavior in an organism is the development of the behavior. When I was very young, there are many things I couldn't do. I couldn't walk, I couldn't talk, I was barely able to eat, but now I can do a few more things. And unfortunately, as a consequence, I'm probably much more dangerous, not very useful. Anyway, so you can ask questions about how behaviors developed. That is a proximal cause, and the ultimate cause of behaviors are what happens over many, many generations. How did this behavior essentially evolve? So a question that you can ask is, how did locomotion evolve? How did locomotion evolve in the context of a single cell? How did locomotion evolve in the context of multicellular systems? How did locomotion evolve as a function of environment? And this is going to be something which is going to come back again and again. I can't only think about the organism, I have to think about the environment. If the tape of life was played all over again, will we or won't we see the same kinds of things that we have today? And this is a question that we can debate, and I'm sure everybody has opinions, as do I. So these are the kinds of questions that you could ask, and what I'd like to do over the next 50 minutes or so is to combine somehow the left side perspective, coming from a physical perspective, and a right side perspective, coming more from a biological perspective, because these behaviors matter, because these behaviors perhaps give an organism or the collection of organisms an advantage relative to situations where they didn't have the behavior, and that selective advantage then over evolutionary timescales allows for these selective pressures to lead to certain kinds of behaviors which you see more and more. That's why you have to worry about these questions, not only from the what and how, but also from the proximal and the distal limits, what happens in an organism and how it happens over time. Where can you study this? Well, you can pick any organism you want. You can pick your favorite organism. You can pick gazelles if you want. You can pick humans if you want. I find humans too complicated. We picked insects. And the reason we picked insects, I'll introduce my students in my group in a little while. We picked insects for the following set of reasons. They are the oldest, most specious animal group on our planet. By species animal group, I mean an animal group which consists of multicellular organisms, not single-cell organisms. Single-cell organisms, there are even more. We wanted to study something where there is a collection of organisms. Each organism is itself made of a collection of cells. We're not sure yet, but we think that they've been around for almost 500 million years. Life itself on our planet has been around for about 2.5 billion years. Our planet's been around for a lot longer than that. And we now believe that we have about 1 million species. We don't know how many we are losing. We don't know how many we have not been found, but we have about 1 million species. So a very, very vast array of these multicellular organisms, and they occupy almost every niche that you can imagine. You can see them on land, you can see them in the water, surprisingly. You may be surprised. You can also see them in the air. Darwin already saw spiders, which essentially spend very, very long periods of time in the air, and they balloon. He found them on an island. He also found them on the mainland, and he figured that they moved from the island to the mainland and vice versa by essentially having long silk threads, and they use this to balloon. Okay, so you find them almost everywhere, so that's a good thing. more interestingly, even though there are more than 1 million species of insects, number of social insects which essentially group together, only 4 kinds. Okay? And why do we want to study social insects? Because I said we want to study collective behavior. Social insects are defined by a small set of characteristics, of which I've listed a few over here. The most important is that they have common nests. So they essentially live together, like humans. There are some big differences. We can't essentially generalize, and I'll come back to that as well. Perhaps you can ask me questions. They also are critically associated with having a reproductive division of labor, which means the queen, in a termite mound, the queen in a beehive is the only organism which is capable of reproducing. And so this is not so dissimilar than what happens in us. We also have a very clear distinction between what's called the soma and the germline. Okay, so we have a germline, so the sperm in the male, the ova in the female, that is completely distinct from the rest of the organism. Remarkably, social insects have a very similar situation. So the queen is the only part of the hive or of the colony which is capable of reproducing. They have cooperative brood care, so many organisms will take care of the young, even though the queen is the only one which will essentially reproduce. And rather remarkably, similar to us, they have overlapping generations, which means they have a sense of culture, which means you can essentially transmit information not just genetically, but also because you can essentially transmit information through learning, through adaptation, and through changing the environment. So there are lots of similarities, but there are very big differences. The biggest difference is that social insects are clonal, which means that every organism in a colony genetically is identical. Which means that what matters from an evolutionary point of view, what matters, therefore, from the point of view of thinking about the biology of how these systems live or not, what matters is the fact that the organism individually doesn't matter. It's the colony as a whole that matters, which is very different from us. We are very similar to each other. We are all humans, but we are not clonally identical. Okay? So as I said, there are many similarities. There's a very big difference, which is that social insects are clonal. And just like us, they are capable of solving very, very complicated spatial problems by essentially recognizing that they can do things on scales much larger than an individual. For example, a bee can create a hive. A termite, I'll show you, can create a mound, which is 1,000 times larger than you or me. I know Burj Khalifa is not so far from here. I haven't seen it. But it was planned, it was designed, and it's not 1,000 times larger than a human. 1,000 times larger than a human would be 2 kilometers high. Not been done. But termites have been doing and creating mounds for, we think, 300, 400 million years. So there's some remarkable problems that they managed to solve. How do they do this? Okay? So zooming in even more, instead of telling you about all the remarkable things that one can essentially study in the context of collective behavior, what I want to tell you is studies associated with architecture, because it's easy to measure. If an organism builds something, it's relatively easy to measure it, it's easy to manipulate it, and then it's also relatively easy to essentially start doing experiments to essentially see under what conditions they do or they don't. Here is, for example, an ant bridge connecting maybe a part of a plant over here to another part of a plant over there, and the ants, instead of moving all the way around, have figured out a way to essentially create a bridge. This is a living bridge. The ants necessarily in one part of the bridge stay there for some period of time, but then other ants essentially replace them. And so over time, the entire bridge is made of different ants. That's not so different from us. The cells that are in me and the cells that are in you are essentially almost all different from the ones that were there when you were born. There's enormous recycling. Okay? So interesting question. How do they form this on the scale of centimeters? This is a cluster of bees. The bees are essentially hanging off each other. Why does this happen? When does this happen? I'll come back to. This is a wasp nest. And my favorite example is a termite mound. As I said, a termite mound can be of the order of a few meters in height. It's built by termites which are smaller than the size of my nail. And so what are the questions now? Even more focused, in a more focused way. How are these functional architectures built? What are they for? Well, it's quite clear what they are for. They allow for this collection of organisms to control the input and output of energy. For example, energy from the sun, not become too hot, not become too cold. They allow for food to move in and out, and they allow information from the environment to come in and out. Information associated with predation, information associated with risks associated with changes in the weather, and so on and so forth. And the critical thing that we need to add in order to start thinking about these from and differently from the point of view of thinking about passive properties of things which are around us right now, pieces of a chair, a table, and so on, is that all these active systems are capable of coordination, capable of communication, and organization. And what I want to show you through examples is that they do this without a plan or a planner, without a design or a designer, but they do this by combining what they can do individually, responding to simple rules, and then harnessing the environment. The environment has always been there. In a sense, it's always been there for much, much longer than multicellular organisms. So from an evolutionary perspective, or at least from a theoretical perspective, we would think evolution would be foolish not to take advantage of it, and I'm going to show you examples where it has taken advantage of it. And so the message, if you want, which will come back in a litany again and again, is to ask how organismal behavior, which can change very quickly over the time scale of the behavior of an organism, which can be days, weeks, or months, or even 100 years, compared to environmental dynamics. We build buildings, we build cities, we build entire cultures, which can last 1,000 years, much, much larger time scales. How do we essentially think about that? OK, so the three examples that I want to tell you about are the first is a termite mound. What does it do? How is it built? What can we say about these things by studying it in different environments? And so we studied this in southern India, starting about 10 years ago. We then did some field experiments, not in India alone, but also in Namibia, in southern Namibia. And then with colleagues, we essentially got some data from parts of West Africa. OK, so and what am I showing you over here? I'm showing an image of a termite mound. And on the right side is a termite mound during the day. And on the left side, it's the same thing at night. And this has been taken with an infrared camera. And the infrared camera shows which parts are hot and which parts are cold. The cold parts are in purple or mauve. The orange parts are essentially hot. So you can see some parts are hot and other parts are cold, and they switch. And I'll show you what this essentially means. The second example, so rather than studying in the field, here, the second example we studied in a place not so far from where I typically stay and work, Concord Field Station, which is in western Massachusetts. And I'll show you, instead of a passive ventilating system, which I'll claim is what the termite mound is, I'll show you how bees actively ventilate their hives. And this is an interesting question. You know, you are here in Abu Dhabi, and the temperatures over here fluctuate a lot. And so for humans to inhabit this place, you need to essentially modulate the temperature inside. One way to do this is you switch on the AC, switch on the heater, do whatever you have to do. Another way, and this is all done by planning, it's done in a very coordinated way. Another way to do it, I'm going to show you, is to essentially have this self-organize. Is just say, oh, let different rules essentially play themselves out, and I'll show you some evidence associated with how bees do this. And the third example, and this will lead me to some lessons at the end, is associated with saying, once we do this with insects in the wild, insects in the lab, can we essentially build simple rules and see if we can reconstruct these things using robots? Can we essentially build robotic ants? OK, so the message at the beginning, and I'll repeat this again, is the short answer is we think the answer is yes. And the way these organisms do this is by using very simple local rules to sense the environment and actuate it. And actuated means changing what the local environment is. And that local environment is controlled by some non-local physics, simple things which we are able to write down but not completely understand the consequences of very well, associated with flow and motion and whatnot. And that gives you architecture, and that architecture is essentially functional. OK, so first, a quick story about termites. Termites are thought to be terrible because they destroy wooden buildings. So if you live in a wooden house, you want to get rid of them. But I want to essentially tell you about the most remarkable thing about termites, which is first that they are there on every part of our planet except Antarctica. We think there are about 3,000 species. Each termite individual is about the size of my nail. In a mound, you can have 1 million termites. So again, think about human buildings. We don't have anything like that. And if we did, it would be a nightmare in trying to understand how to organize it. But termites have been doing this, and they've been doing this for 500 million years. Here's another remarkable fact about termite mounds. This is Great Britain. That's the coast of South America. For size, that is the scale not of a single termite mound, but of a field of termite mounds. And that's the scale bar over here, 300 kilometers. So termite mounds have essentially been capable, not just an individual mound, which has a few million inhabitants, but the mounds create themselves an ecology, and that ecology can be on the scale of an island, okay? They have been, so this was a paper, people believe that this has essentially been around for a few thousand years. How did this happen? So they not only change the environment, but they are changed by the environment. So a very interesting question over there. As I said, we started studying this about 10 years ago in southern India, this particular species of Rototermes obesus. It's, as I said, 4 millimeters long. A termite mound is not solid. A termite mound is porous. It's sand, it's clay, it's essentially bodies of termites. It's the spit of termites. This is what it looks like from the outside. This is what it looks like from the top. You break it, and it's hollow. But it's not hollow uniformly. The outside, the walls are very, very small. The holes in the wall, the pores are tiny. As I go further and further inwards, the holes become larger. And the holes are not randomly oriented. The holes are more or less vertically oriented. So you can ask why, and I'll come back to that. So you can ask, why is this happening? How might they be built? And what does it mean for the ecology? I will not tell you about these larger scale effects associated with what happens on the scale of, for example, an island. I'll try and say a little bit about the physiology and the morphogenesis, for which we need to essentially do some experiments, and I'll construct some simple-minded theories. Okay, so anywhere in physics, anywhere in biology, you start with anatomy. I want to understand the structure. Without understanding the structure, it's very hard to say anything. So this is what the anatomy of a termite mound is. If you look at the termite mound from outside, it looks like this wonderful fluted tower, but it doesn't have to be fluted. It can be approximately conical. If you break it and dig underneath, you see that there is something called the gallery, and the gallery is often larger than the mound itself. And in the gallery, the termites essentially host fungi, and the fungi serve as food for their brood, for the young termites. If you cut it with, for example, a large saw, a chainsaw, for example, as I said before, you see these holes. You can also do something which a colleague of mine, Rupert Sohr, did, and this is an image from his experiment. You can pour gypsum, so magnesium sulfate and calcium sulfate into it, let it solidify, and then blast away everything else so that all the mud and the clay goes away. So you get a negative view of the termite mound. And the negative view of the termite mound looks like this. Again, lots of columnar channels, and these lots of columnar channels have connections between them, and that's it. The outside has essentially been taken away. Okay, so what is it good for? So the best way to introduce this is to allow my favorite natural historian, David Attenborough, to essentially tell you a story which he narrates in one of the BBC stories.
Here in South Africa, it can also get very hot, but there's no danger of flooding. So termites can take refuge from the heat below ground, where it's cool and relatively stable. But 2 million insects living below ground create a different kind of problem. The air around them gets stale. So termites need to have a way of linking the underground air with the fresh air above, a ventilation system. And they do that with this. And to see how it works, you've got to look inside. Using the latest scanning techniques, we can create a picture of the mound's interior.
It's not so latest anymore. It's 15 years old.
An intricate network of passages lead to a central chimney. Hot, stale air from the insect population below rises up through the chimney. But the top of the mound is sealed. So how does this stale air escape? The mound may look as though it has strong defensive walls like a fortress, but in fact these walls are porous, and their primary purpose is to harness the wind. Fresh air blowing against the side of the mound is forced through the tiny holes in these walls. From there, it travels through the smaller tunnels until it reaches the central chimney. Here, the cooler, fresh air mixes with the hot, stale air rising from the insect community below. Meanwhile, some air is blown around the side of the mound. This creates a suction that pulls the stale air out of the chimney and out through the outer walls. So an internal air current is created and the whole mound ventilated.
Okay.
The mound's inhabitants spend most of their time close to or below ground level.
So I saw this movie, and I initially believed it, and then I thought about it, and you can do a little calculation, and you can convince yourself, and the calculation is associated with asking, well, is it really true that if I have the air blowing past it, that there is a suction which will essentially act on the size of the pore? And it turns out, if you do the calculation, you find that's not possible. So what do? Well, you go and make a measurement. And so with Sam Ocko and Hunter King, we went to Namibia, and I'll spare you the details. I'll simply tell you what we found. And what we found is even more remarkable. We found that the termite mound works like a lung. Okay? And the way it works like a lung is it's heated during the day. And you can look at the pictures over there and then, or watch me. It's heated during the day. And if it's heated during the day, where does it get heated first? The outside gets heated first. If the outside gets heated first, where does the air get heated? The air just inside the wall gets heated. If the air inside gets heated, then the air wants to rise. And as David Attenborough pointed out, and as you see a termite, there is no way for the air to escape from the top. So the air, hot air, starts to rise inside the mound, close to the outer walls, and that has to go somewhere. It has to go down, and goes down in the center where it's not heated yet. So you have, during the day, these very large-scale circulations, like this. At night, which part cools first? The outside cools first. If the outside cools first, now the air reverses. So the termite mound is actually a lung which breathes twice a day. And it's driven by the diurnal fluctuations, the temperature variations between day and night. And immediately you can say, that means termites which are in the tropics will be different in size from termites in the savanna. Termites which are in termite mounds which are in the shade will be different from those in the sun, and you see that immediately. Those which you see, for example, on trees are small. Those outside are large. Those in the savanna are very, very tall because you have very large diurnal variations in temperature. Those which are in less in climes where the temperature variations are not much larger, not too much, are much smaller. So qualitatively, you say, I think there is something to this. Quantitatively, you can measure things like the temperature in a mound when the mound is occupied, when the mound is not occupied, and you find that, in fact, there is no difference, and therefore, this idea that you have gases within the termite mound associated with the inhabitants drives it, doesn't seem to hold air or water in this case. Okay, so we can understand that, and then you can images, you can calculate things, and so on. Then you can ask, how is this built? And I want you to listen to another remarkable scientist, evolutionary biologist John Maynard Smith, who describes what it is in words, and I'll show you in equations.
Now, what's fascinating to me about this is that if you came across a building like that, you'd assume that some architect had designed it, and he'd had a blueprint of some kind, right, a drawing of how it was going to go, and he told people exactly what to do. Now, this termite mound, nobody had an image of the complete building. I mean, no termite has a picture of the whole mound. All the termites do is they build the mound, and they're following some rules. And to be honest, I don't think we know exactly what those rules are. My guess is that they're fairly simple.
Okay, so this was 35, 40 years ago. I want to now suggest some possible rules, and I want to suggest some consequences of those, and I want to show you some qualitative observation, or tell you about some qualitative observations. So first, on the large scale, okay? So here is, in pictures, what we think is happening, for which there's a lot of evidence, and increasingly so quantitatively, first qualitatively. So if you have airflow, termites, not all, but almost all insects, communicate with each other by using small molecules, pheromones, and these pheromones are volatile. So they easily move into the air, and therefore they'll be pushed around by any air currents. So that air will essentially move these cues around. Those cues may cause the termite to build or to break part of the mound. Building or breaking part of the mound changes the mound morphology, but changing the mound morphology, changing the building, will change the airflow. And so now you have a closed loop where the passive mechanics of fluid flow coupled with a sensory interaction between termites changes their behavior, changes their morphology, and the whole thing can essentially start creating something which is potentially stable as a final shape. So in a nutshell, as Churchill said, we shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us. In pictures, so that was in words, in pictures, showing the same thing over here. As I said, during the day, you have motions like this. At nighttime, the whole thing reverses. As these air currents move around, they move pheromones. Most of the time, most of the pheromones live in the gallery. If they live in the gallery and they create these pheromones move around. They move much more in the vertical direction because of buoyancy, because hot air will rise, than in the horizontal direction. That already explains why mounds are tall, much taller than they are wider. And as the air moves, it moves the pheromones, and the pheromones then change the building rules. So you have to construct a theory, if you want, which essentially connects the building behavior to the airflow. The airflow is driven by temperature variations, which vary during night and day and during seasons, and then they move around the pheromones. Okay, so that's what I said in words. In pink are the equations. Don't worry about them. You can essentially quantify this behavior using a set of equations which tell you how diurnal variations change airflow. The airflow then changes the pheromone concentration. And then in words, here is a rule, very simple rule, which says build if the pheromone concentration is larger than some critical value, build out inwards or allow it to decay if the pheromone concentration is smaller than a value. And you can construct some frameworks for that, which again I won't get into, and out of that you can essentially construct a mathematical theory from which you can see shapes of mounds. And I already told you some qualitative facts. If the temperature variations between night and day are very large, then the mounds will be tall. We see that in the savanna, the mounds are 3-4 meters in height. If the pheromone concentration, if the temperature variations between night and day are small, then you'll see smaller mounds. You see this, for example, in southern India, or you see this in these termite mounds which you see in trees. So qualitatively correct, quantitatively we don't know. These experiments are not inexpensive, and nobody has done them yet. All right. So what have I shown you? I've shown you that John Maynard Smith, in words was correct. We've done a tiny bit more by converting those words into equations and then converting those equations into pictures. So perhaps some attempt at compression. And the critical point is no need for a plan, no need for a planner, but we do use, or we think that termites use, and all the evidence suggests that this is correct, that they change their environment and their behavior is changed as a consequence. So they are using their environment as a communication channel. They don't communicate with each other directly. They communicate with each other using the environment. And this is famously called stigmergy. From the cognate stig is to essentially touch, and mergy is work. So essentially they do work by communicating with each other, not directly. So for example, you can communicate with a friend through a book. You can communicate with a friend by leaving a signal in the environment, like when you were a child playing games. The same way, insects do this using chemical means. Insects can do this we do this using physical and chemical means. We also do this culturally. So that's a way to think about this. And when you compare the calculations with real termite mounds, you see you're able to capture some of the behavior. But then we look inside the termite mound, you see the termite mound inside is even more complex. The inside of the termite mound is like a set of layers, like a parking garage, in fact. So you can ask, can I explain that? Can I understand not just the behavior of the mound as a whole? Can I understand how, not the behavior, the building of a mound as a whole? Can I understand the building of the inside of the mound? So this is an image from Guy Terraloz at Toulouse. They took a small mound, not the size of a meter or two. They took a small mound which can fit in a hand. So you can see over here the scale is of the order of a few centimeters, stuck it in a tomograph CT scan machine, and they watched the inside without breaking it, and you see these beautiful layered structures. But just like in a parking garage, when you go from one layer to the other, you need a way to go from one layer to the other, so you must have some paths. Those paths could be ramps. They could also be helicoids. You see both, and these happen spontaneously. Again, no plan and no planner. Okay, so you have these linear ramps. These are dislocations of various kinds. I won't get into the details. You can also write on equations. Again, as I said, hum your way through them. I'll describe them in a minute in words. But pay attention, if you will, to this picture over here, which describes what's happening. Okay, just the same as I said on the scale of the whole mound. The termites are could be classified into two kinds. Worker termites, which are essentially loaded, so they have clay, which they use to move from one place to the other, or unloaded termites. So the termites which are loaded respond to these pheromones. They move material around, change the shape of the mound. By changing the shape of the mound, they change the way these pheromones move around. That means that they change their motion. Changing their motion changes how they secrete pheromones. Changing the pheromone concentration changes how they build. And again, you have this closed loop. And one can construct, as I said, a framework mathematically which tells you how the mound material is laid down by termites which are loaded and taken away by termites which are unloaded, how the termite workers which are loaded and unloaded switch, and how this pheromone moves around. And when you solve the equations, you can essentially get both these kinds of defects. Sometimes you get these linear ramps, which essentially connect one layer to the other. Sometimes you get helicoidal or helical ramps. And then you can ask questions about how common are these helical ramps? How uncommon are they? Where do they appear? We are still in the process of essentially studying some of that. We don't have an answer yet. But if there is a message, the message is without a plan and without a planner, this system, again, becomes easily adaptable. If it breaks, no problem. The planner doesn't have to come. The plumber doesn't have to come and fix things. This automatically changes the flow rates. It changes the pheromone concentration. So the termites will just respond locally. And so having these local rules allows you to be repairable, allows you to be adaptable, as a function of what? As a function of a small number of parameters. It turns out there are 3 actual parameters which matter, and these parameters may be under selection. We don't know yet. When you go from one environment to another, when you go from the savannah to India, or when you go from Florida to Arizona, these parameters may be the ones which are switching around. So there are many, many potentially microscopic processes which gradually get averaged out into a small number of macroscopic parameters, and that's what seems to be enough. Okay, that's a thought. Okay, again, the litany. No plan, no planner, doesn't seem to have any external control except the environment. Again, the environment behaves as a communication channel. And again, I want to emphasize, maybe I didn't say this clearly enough, building and unbuilding on the scale of a termite is happening quickly. The mound itself is changing very, very slowly. So things are happening fast and things are happening slowly, but I have to worry about both. If I assume the environment is fixed, then the problem becomes boring. If the environment is changing too quickly, it's equally boring, because that means I'm always struggling. Oh, the environment has changed, it's become hot, it's become cold, I do something immediately. That's like having a switch associated with putting the air conditioner on or off, and as soon as the temperature goes below critical value, switch it on, and vice versa. That will lead to chaos. You need to have, well, I'm not saying you need to have, we think that having separation of scales between how quickly things happen on the scale of the organism and how quickly things happen on the scale of the environment are important. Unless, as we are on our planet at this point, we are close to a potential catastrophe, where we've started to change things on the scale of the planet so much that it becomes very, very hard to reverse. Okay? So in these problems, perhaps it might be possible, in these problems that I'm telling you about, unlike the problem that we are facing ourselves, potentially an existential crisis, it's possible to essentially use the scale separation to make some progress. Okay, so I have about 15 minutes or so, or less? 15, okay, all right. So what I'm going to do now is quickly tell you about the same kind of question associated with collective behavior, but with bees, and then I'm going to switch to robots. I won't tell you about ventilation in detail, because I want to introduce bugs, and then, bots, and then beyond. Okay, so I want to show you a movie first. It's a movie in the Concord Field Station. And this is a movie. I wasn't shaking the tree. This tree was just spontaneously shaking and in the wind. And what you see over here is a beard of bees. Okay, so the bees are hanging off from each other. They are not creating a beehive. They're just hanging off from each other. Why do they do this? So I'll tell you something about natural history of apiculture or of studying bees. The bees do this when they're essentially in the process of moving from one home to another. So there's this wonderful story for which Carl von Frisch got the Nobel Prize in 1968, associated with how do they signal to each other. So bees actually have an effective democracy that allows them to talk to each other, and the way they talk to each other is by waggling their wings. And the amount of waggling of the wings, the orientation with which they do so, and the number of bees that do so allows them to tell all the other bees, hey, I've found a cool new place there. The orientation tells them how far it is. The aptitude tells them this is really cool. And the number of bees which essentially participate tells them, you all should pay attention. Okay, so there's a very beautiful story associated with here's what you should actually consider. The second part of the story is once they've decided through a democracy, there's a wonderful book called Honeybee Democracy by Tom Seeley, which I invite you to read. Second part of the story is now let's all go. If you want to go and it's far away, you can't make this trip in one day. And if you can't make this trip in one day, you might have to stay overnight. And when you stay overnight, there's a problem. Because when bees essentially transition, which they do typically in fall or early winter, it can become cold. And bees, like us, go into a chill coma. The temperature becomes too low, 15 degrees Celsius for Apis mellifera, which is the bee that we study. So it becomes too cold, they will die. And if they die, that's the end of the colony. So what do? They huddle. That's what you would do. That's what anybody over here would do if you start becoming very cold. Now you have to huddle. What's the best solution? The best solution is to huddle into a sphere, because then you expose minimally yourself to the environment. Well, you can't huddle on this. You can't create a sphere because you'll be on the ground, and some little bear or me or you will go and pick it up. Okay? So you've got to hang. So now there's a problem. If I have to hang, I have to have enough contact. That means I can't be a sphere. But if I can't be a sphere, that means I'm essentially likely to become too cold. So there is an interesting balance between how much do I essentially care about mechanical stability of the cluster versus thermal stability or thermal instability. And this is something that comes up again and again when we think about function. When we think about collective behavior and you want to pose questions associated with function, I want to do many things. I want to see all these movies. I want to write all these papers. What do I do? How do I decide? So there's always a cost and benefit. And I want to show you experiments what you can do in order to essentially study some tiny, tiny aspect of this. Okay? So first one is studying mechanical stability. So again, I'm going to ask you now to think about an experiment where I put you in an elevator and I start shaking the elevator. Sometimes the elevator will shake on its own. What is your natural response? What's a young person? What is the natural response if the elevator is starting to shake? What would you do? How? Young person. Okay, you're young at heart. You have someone raising the hand there. Yeah. Very good. So you stabilize yourself, you're reaching the wall. Suppose you're in the center or the elevator is too large. What could you do? Lay down. Very good. You want to lie down. You want to be as close to the ground so that if you fall, you don't fall too far. What if now you have a large number of you? Everybody wants to lay down. And that's what the bees do, except that instead of laying down, they come close to the surface. So here's an experiment. Maybe it'll play, maybe it won't. I won't try. Yeah, OK. So here's an experiment. So what we did was to take a wooden board, put a queen bee so that all the bees are attracted to the queen bee, but put the queen bee in a cage which was open to air so that they could communicate. The queen bee could communicate. And all the bees clustered around that. And then we started shaking the wooden board to simulate what happens naturally. So when you start shaking the board, you can shake it this way, you can shake it that way. I won't get into the details. When you start shaking it, what you find is all the bees start moving towards the surface. Now you'd say, oh, that is one solution, but another solution is the bees can leave. But if they leave, then they may not survive the night. So now, again, qualitatively, you have this tension between different possibilities. And the solution is that the bee behaves like a drop, except it's not really a drop of liquid, it's a drop of bees. And the drop starts to essentially move towards the surface and stabilize itself. And this is a kind of, and I'm going to be a little loose over here, I can answer questions later on, a kind of mechanical altruism. Because by all the bees moving towards the board, they are collectively doing better, even though individually it would make sense for the bees at the bottom to say, I'm out, I leave. Because the only bees which are supporting the loader at the top, that's not what they do. When we measure the number of bees which leave, it's less than 10%. Almost all the bees collectively move towards the surface. Okay? All right. So you can start quantifying this. I won't get into the details. But again, from a physical point of view, this is a wonderful simple example, I mean, simple to state, not at all simple to study, where, since Galileo, we've been studying problems associated with how a pendulum swings and this way and how a pendulum swings that way and so on. Now, this is a system where this whole thing is behaving like some very, very complicated pendulum, but the pendulum is not made of one bob, it's made of 100,000 bobs, and these bobs are all interacting with each other. So it's active, it's also functional. It's very important because if this possibility didn't exist, perhaps all the colonies would have been wiped out, but the colonies were able to essentially stabilize themselves, survived. But I told you, it's not only mechanical stability, it's also thermal stability. They can't get too cold. Okay, so you can ask the same question. Now I can take this whole system, I put it in a box, and I cool it and I heat it. And I can ask what happens then. Okay, so here is the same cluster of bees, the same board. We don't do both these together. We didn't have the money to do that at that time. There's something to try. What would you guess? When you become very hot, all of you collectively, as I am becoming quite hot now, what do you want to do? Yeah, okay. So you spread out. So that's what happens. They spread out, but they don't leave. Let me show you what happens. Look at the temperature, 15 degrees. It goes up to 30 degrees, go back to 15 degrees, slowly. And how do they spread out? They hold each other, but they spread their limbs out, or they hold each other and they contract. Okay? So they change the pores, they change the air inside, and by changing the air inside, that means they can allow for ventilation, and by allowing for ventilation, I'm being anthropomorphic over here, forgive me, but when you think about function, I don't know whether you have a choice but to be somewhat teleological, and then you can start unpacking that teleology. Okay, so the interesting question is, what happens if you put these two together? We don't know. Which one wins? Do I care more about thermal stability? Do I care more about mechanical stability? I suspect that, as you might imagine, that if the winds become very extreme, mechanical stability dominates. If temperature variations are extreme, then thermal stability dominates. And a very interesting question, which we don't have an answer to, but perhaps we can unpack this one bit at a time, is ask how, as a function of an environment, do sensing capabilities modulate the kind of behavioral responses, the Tinbergen question, if you want. A third question. I showed you termite ventilation in the case of a passive mound. Okay, so mound was there, and the termites were essentially they built the mound in order to ventilate their nest. How many of you over here have any experience with keeping bees? Anybody? Okay, Eberhard. So in a bee box, people who keep bees have little slats, and in the slats you have bees. You put the slats next to each other, you put them in a box, keep them outside, tend to them regularly. And here's what you see when you essentially watch them carefully. Okay? What you see, this is the bee box over here, size scale over here. This is the entrance and the exit to the bees. Inside, the bees essentially create a pseudo hive. They have their brood, their young ones, and the brood they have to get their food. They have to make sure that the oxygen over there is high enough, carbon dioxide doesn't become too high, and the temperature can't become too low because they go into coma. Okay? So what happens? Very quickly, I'm going to show you a video. I won't get into the details of this. So these bee boxes are an extreme version of, instead of having a hole in a tree or a slit, the bee boxes are controlled. Here, unlike in the termite mound, there is no control over the environment, and the bees have to do whatever they can given the environment. The advantage of having a home is that it's easy to occupy. The disadvantage is it may not be good for you. What do you mean by it's not good for you? If I'm inside and I have a brood, the brood creates carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide goes up. If the carbon dioxide goes up, there's a problem. So what can you do? Well, what do? When the carbon dioxide goes up, we breathe out. And we have an oscillatory solution. We have a solution where, in order to make sure that my lungs remain oxygenated, or my body remains oxygenated, part of the cycle I essentially exhale, and part of the cycle I inhale. What do bees do? When they have a cluster like this on the left side, you can see all the bees hovering around the entrance. They fan actively, and they pull air out. But you can't keep pulling air out, because if you keep pulling air out, what will happen if I try to pull air out? Somebody young from a sphere, keep pulling air out, what will happen? You won't be able to pull it out anymore, right? either it'll deflate or you just don't have the capacity. So what you have to do, the bees have to give up and then wait for the air to come out. So the bees actually use something called tidal flow. They have a mechanism where part of the cycle, the bees will essentially pull air out, and part of the cycle, they allow the air to go back in. That's one solution. There is another solution, and the other solution, you can see all the bees over here. This is this long opening. You see all the bees over here on one side. It's a different solution. And that different solution is that you pull air out on one side, and then spontaneously the air goes inside the rest of the place. Can we essentially make sense of this? And how does this allow the bees to control the internal microclimate? A short answer is, first, that they do respond to temperature variations. So this is a day-night cycle shown in red, hot during the day, cold at night. But on the inside, it's rock solid. How do they do this? Or, actually not or yet, the bees also respond to carbon dioxide. If the carbon dioxide concentration goes up in green, the bees also respond in purple. And if the carbon dioxide concentration goes down, they stop responding. What do I mean by respond? They essentially fan. So I want to now show you a set of images. I hope the video will play. OK. Can you hear the bees fanning? Okay, here's a bee box. You see most of the bees are on one side. So what's happening? So you have a bee box, and if all the bees are on only one side, first question is, in which direction should the fanning happen? Should the fanning happen outwards or inwards? Young person, why? You want to get the air out, but you also want to make a measurement. Because if I pull the air out, I will know what the air inside is. I can measure the temperature, and I can measure the carbon dioxide pulling it out. Very good, OK? So by pulling the air out, here, you allow the air, you force the air to go in over there, because you can't keep pulling the air out. So instead of having tidal flow, where I partially breathe outwards, and then partially I breathe inwards, what you do is continuously pull the air out. I simultaneously can measure the temperature and the carbon dioxide here, and I can then harness that measurement and get more bees to join me. Okay? And so more bees do join, and these bees essentially come here, and they create a localized concentration, which allows the bees to come out, the air to come out over here, and because of the fact that air has to be conserved, the amount of air has to be conserved inside, air has to go in over here, and therefore they create this large-scale circulation. And you see, indeed, that if you measure quantitatively the number of bees, they localize here, for example, more bees here compared to there. This is the bee box dimension. The density of bees is larger, the velocity of the bees is larger, the temperature is larger. The temperature is larger because I'm pulling air from inside where the bees are active. And very interestingly and importantly, you see that the velocity where the bees are fanning outwards is positive, and the velocities where nothing is happening, the velocity is negative. So that the integral of the velocity, the sum of all the velocities, is 0. That means I'm not losing or gaining air. And the bees came up with the solution spontaneously. You didn't have to do anything, no plan, no planner of any kind. Same thing over here. You can do a calculation, and this drives adaptive ventilation patterns. Again, no plan, no planner. OK, so I have 5 minutes. All right, so last story in 5 minutes is we want to now synthesize this. I told you one kind of behavior associated with termites, associated with building mounds. I showed you a few different kinds of behaviors with bees and gave you a little bit of a vignette associated with how they can actively ventilate their bee boxes. We want to now ask, can I essentially synthesize this? Can I recreate some aspects of this using robots? And I want to switch to a third organism, not termites, not ants, sorry, not bees, but ants. I want to show you an experiment. So this is an experiment where you imprisoned the ants. You imprisoned the ants in between two glass plates, and you imprisoned them using a jail, and the jail is made of food. Okay, and the food is sugared gel. And so the bees want to get out, the ants want to get out. So what do? Let me play the movie again. They initially try to dig here. They try to dig there. Can't quite make out what's going on. Okay, so there's one attempt to essentially escape there. There's another attempt to escape over there. You start to see more and more ants over here. So collectively, they're able to create a way for them to escape from this jail. So individually, they can't do it. Collectively, they can. Can you essentially make sense of this? Well, I have now, as I said, in a little bit like being in a religious environment, the litany is, oh, I can do this by essentially thinking about a self-organization where the variables are the ant number at any location, at any instant in time, the environment, which is this jail, and the communication. Ants can communicate with each other by essentially touching themselves, touching their antennae with each other, or by using pheromones, either one of them. And I won't bother you with equations, but I'll show you what happens when you essentially calculate the solution of these equations. If there's a single ant struggling a lot, many ants, you see the color change, and the color changes because if a set of ants stays at one location, then the chemical concentration of the pheromones over there becomes large. And even if the ants are moving around randomly, because there's a higher concentration at one location, they're more likely to essentially end up over there. If they're more likely to end up over there, this thing, through positive feedback, runs away, and they escape. But there is a Goldilocks zone, because if the pheromones didn't decay at all, then everywhere there'll be pheromones, and they'll be exactly like where there will be no pheromones. So this becomes a problem. OK. All right, last slide. Can we create them? So here are some attempts to create this using robots. The organism is now essentially a microcontroller with a battery, 2 wheels, a light sensor which can sense the light intensity, put it on a TV. The light intensity plays the equivalent role of a pheromone, so we call them photohormones. And there is another magnet which allows them to pick up and drop the environment, which is the jail. You put this on a TV screen. The ants, or the robotic ants, don't communicate with each other at all. The only thing that they do is to release photohormone, or the photohormone essentially eventually starts to degrade, and that information is captured through a webcam. There is no connection between the ants directly. And let me show you a couple of movies and stop. So these are ants, or robotic ants, which are not able to communicate with each other. And the reason they're not able to communicate with each other is because they are essentially behaving independently. They are not responding at all to their environment. On the right side is a situation where they are responding to the environment very strongly. And the environment over here is a light signal. The light signal over there starts to go up because a few robotic ants started over there. Other robotic ants reach that place. They randomly pick up and drop the pillars, but they happen to hang out over there for more time than they would over here. And a consequence of that is eventually they break through. So over here, no cooperation at all, but the cooperation is induced by the environment. Here, the cooperation induced by the environment, stigmergy, allows them to essentially escape. And you can construct then a situation very similar to what you see in reality, where you change either the excavation rate or the cooperation parameter, and there is this Goldilocks zone where things succeed. Otherwise, they get jammed, so they essentially make no progress, or they're all solitary, and therefore they make no progress, or they're lazy, and therefore they don't make no progress. OK, so I'm done. I showed you a few examples in different systems associated with how you can solve problems in a collective way when you are able to use the physical fields which exist to communicate with each other. That means that the boundaries between what you consider to be living and non-living start to melt away. Because when you take away the non-living part, you essentially deprive the living organism of being able to take advantage of the environment, which they have been taking advantage of ever since life has existed on our planet. A different way of stating this is not only have to be thinking about embodiment, which is the ability of us to think about the brain in a body, but we cannot ignore the environment. So we can't just think about embodiment. We have to think about, if you want, exbodiment. And somebody who essentially proposed this a long, long time ago is an organizational behaviorist and early pioneer in computer science, Herb Simon, who said that just because an ant is essentially moving through what looks like an extremely complicated trajectory doesn't mean the ant's behavior is very complicated. It simply means the environment is complicated. So don't confuse, he said, the complexity of the environment for the complexity of the behavior of the organism, because these are working together. They may be working on different time scales. OK, second message. These architectures are functional, they are dynamic, and they couple the living with the non-living. Very simple rules: local sensing, local action, mediated by global physics. The physics could be the passive physics of diffusion, of flow, of deformations, of all of these things. It doesn't really matter. Super importantly, there is no plan, there is no planner, and as a consequence, you're very, very robust to errors. And very importantly, we all live in this age of machine learning. I ask questions about intelligence. And intelligence, typically, we think of as associated with having a goal. No, you don't need to have that necessarily, as these simple examples show. You don't even have a representation of what you want to do. You don't have a plan. You don't have a planner. You get all this for free if you also start thinking about, on an evolutionary time scale, the functional consequences and the selection pressures associated with that. OK. And finally, I showed you a little bit of an example of how we are starting to think about using robots to essentially build in these behaviors and take Tinbergen's quartet, if you want, and add tiny physical mimics and mathematical theories. And I will stop there. There's a question at the end. I'm sorry I went over. Apologies. And I forgot to add, but none of this, I work in collective behavior, so obviously this has to be done as part of a collective. And so this is the termite team, the bee band, and the ant army. But I'm happy to take questions.